You're standing in the dead center of Australia, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest city. The red earth stretches endlessly in every direction. The temperature hits 45 degrees Celsius. There's no water for 100 kilometers. No shops. No hospitals. No neighbors. This is the reality for less than 3% of Australia's population. Meanwhile, on the coast, millions of people are crammed into a narrow strip of land barely 50 kilometers wide. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, all hugging the shoreline like they're afraid to let go. It's one of the most extreme population distributions on Earth. A continent the size of the United States, with almost nobody living in the middle. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't just about Australians loving the beach. This is a story written in geology, carved by climate, and shaped by patterns that were set in motion millions of years before humans ever set foot on the continent. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Australia became the world's emptiest inhabited continent, and why that's probably never going to change. Let's start with a number that sounds almost impossible. Australia is the 6th largest country in the world, covering 7.7 million square kilometers. That's roughly the same size as the continental United States. But here's the shocking part. 26 million people live in Australia. The United States has 330 million. Even if you account for Alaska being largely uninhabited, the difference is staggering. Australia has 1/10 the population living in the same amount of space. And it gets even more extreme when you look at where those 26 million people actually live. 85 to 90% of Australians live within 50 kilometers of the coast. Some estimates push that number even higher when you look how many live within just 20 kilometers of the ocean. We're talking about one of the most urbanized countries on Earth, with people packed into coastal cities, while an area larger than Western Europe's that's nearly empty in the interior. So what's going on here? The simple answer people usually give is the Outback. Everyone's heard of it. The vast, red, empty center of Australia. Deadly snakes, scorching heat, endless desert. And yes, that's all true. But that answer doesn't actually explain anything. It just restates the question. Why is the Outback so inhospitable? Why doesn't Australia have more rivers, more rainfall, more fertile land in the interior, like other continents? To understand that, we need to go back, way back. We're talking hundreds of millions of years. Australia wasn't always an island continent. It was once part of Gondwana, a massive supercontinent that included South America, Africa, Antarctica, and India. Around 180 million years ago, Gondwana started breaking apart. Australia remained connected to Antarctica until about 45 million years ago, when it finally split off and began drifting north. Now here's the critical part. As Australia drifted, it became geologically stable, very stable. Most of the continent sits on some of the oldest, most worn-down rock on Earth. We're talking about land that has been eroding for billions of years. Other continents have young, tall mountain ranges created by tectonic activity. The Himalayas, the Rockies, the Andes. These mountains are still growing, still being pushed up by colliding tectonic plates. These mountain ranges do something crucial. They create rain. When moisture-laden winds hit a mountain range, the air is forced upward. As it rises, it cools. Cool air can't hold as much moisture as warm air, so the water condenses and falls as rain or snow. This is called orographic precipitation, and it's the reason why mountain ranges create lush, green regions on one side and often dry regions on the other. Australia doesn't have this. The Great Dividing Range along the east coast is the closest thing to a major mountain range, but it's ancient and worn down. Mount Kosciuszko, the highest peak in mainland Australia, is just 2,228 meters tall. That's less than half the height of many peaks in the Rockies or Alps. These low, old mountains don't create the same dramatic weather patterns that bring consistent rainfall to continental interiors. But the problems don't stop with old mountains. Australia's position on the globe is working against it. The continent sits roughly between latitudes 10 degrees south and 40 degrees south. that puts a huge portion of Australia in the subtropical high-pressure belt. If you look at a world map, you'll notice something interesting. Deserts tend to appear at specific latitudes. The Sahara, the Arabian Desert, the Kalahari, the Atacama, they all sit roughly between 20 and 30 degrees from the equator. This isn't a coincidence. It's caused by atmospheric circulation patterns called Hadley cells. Here's how it works. At the equator, intense solar heating causes air to rise. This rising air cools, releases moisture as rain, which is why equatorial regions are so wet, and then flows toward the poles at high altitude, around 30 degrees latitude. This air descends back toward the surface. As it descends, it warms up. Warm, descending air creates high pressure and suppresses cloud formation. No clouds means no rain. This is why deserts ring the planet at these latitudes. Australia sits right in this zone. The interior of Australia is dominated by these high-pressure systems, which bring clear skies and very little rainfall. When rain does fall, it's often erratic and unreliable. Some areas might go years without significant precipitation, then get flooded in a single storm event. This makes agriculture extremely difficult and unpredictable. Compare this to North America or Europe, where prevailing westerly winds bring moisture from the oceans deep into the continental interior, creating breadbaskets like the American Midwest or the European plains. Australia doesn't have this advantage. The prevailing winds do bring moisture from the surrounding oceans, but that moisture mostly falls on the coastal areas and the relatively small strips of land that receive orographic rainfall from the Great Dividing Range. Now let's talk about water, because this is where things get really dire for the Australian interior. Rivers are the lifeblood of civilizations. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, all the great ancient civilizations grew up around reliable river systems. Rivers provide water for drinking, irrigation, transportation, and trade. Australia has rivers, but most of them are either short coastal streams or part of the Murray-Darling Basin system. The Murray-Darling is Australia's longest river system, but even it pales in comparison to the great rivers of other continents. The Murray River is 2,508 kilometers long. That sounds impressive until you compare it to the Amazon at 6,400 kilometers, the Nile at 6,650 kilometers, or even the Mississippi at 3,730 kilometers. More importantly, the Murray-Darling system doesn't flow consistently. Parts of it can dry up completely during drought periods. The river system drains about 1/7 of Australia's land area, but it carries very little water compared to its catchment size because rainfall is so low and evaporation is so high. The interior of Australia has very few permanent rivers at all. Some watercourses only flow after rare rainfall events. These are called ephemeral streams, and they can be dry for years or even decades before suddenly running with water after a storm. You cannot build cities or sustain agriculture around rivers that might disappear for years at a time. Then there's the groundwater situation. Some parts of inland Australia do have access to groundwater through the Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest underground water sources in the world. It underlies about 1.7 million square kilometers, roughly 22% of Australia. But here's the problem. Much of this water is salty, sometimes extremely salty. It's also being depleted faster than it's being recharged in many areas. The water that is usable is often used for livestock, particularly sheep and cattle stations that cover enormous areas. These stations might be thousands of square kilometers in size, but support only a handful of people. The water isn't abundant or high quality enough to support dense populations or intensive agriculture over most of the area. So we've got old, worn-down mountains that don't create much rain. We've got atmospheric circulation patterns that create high-pressure systems and desert conditions. We've got very few reliable rivers. We've got limited usable groundwater. The result is that about 70% of Australia is classified as arid or semi-arid. That means 70% of the continent receives less than 600 millimeters of rain per year, with much of it receiving less than 300 millimeters. For context, most agricultural regions need at least 500 to 600 millimeters of rainfall per year to grow crops without irrigation. The interior of Australia is simply too dry to support the kind of intensive agriculture that feeds large populations. But it's not just about water and rainfall. The soils matter too, because Australia is so geologically old and stable. Its soils have been weathered for millions of years. Heavy rainfall in the tropical north and chemical weathering over geological time have leached nutrients from the soil. Australian soils are generally nutrient poor, particularly lacking in phosphorus and nitrogen. Even in areas that do receive adequate rainfall, the soil quality is often not good enough for intensive agriculture without significant fertilizer inputs. The best agricultural land in Australia is found in a relatively narrow band along the southeast and southwest coasts, where rainfall is more reliable and soils are slightly better. Not coincidentally, this is exactly where most Australians live. Let's add another factor into this equation: heat. The Australian interior doesn't just lack water, it's also brutally hot. Summer temperatures in the outback regularly exceed 40 degrees Celsius, sometimes reaching close to 50 degrees. The town of Oodnadatta in South Australia holds the record for the highest reliable temperature ever recorded in Australia, 50.7 degrees Celsius, in January 1960. At these temperatures, human beings need enormous amounts of water just to survive, let alone to grow food or support industries. The combination of extreme heat and extreme aridity creates an environment that is fundamentally hostile to dense human settlement. Now, you might be thinking, but humans are clever, we have technology. Why not just build cities in the interior anyway? Bring in water through pipelines or desalination. Use air conditioning. Build infrastructure. And technically, yes, this is possible. But it's enormously expensive and often not economically rational. Cities exist where they do, because of economic opportunities. People need jobs, which means there need to be industries and businesses. Those industries and businesses need resources, transportation networks, and access to markets. The Australian interior has some mining operations, some cattle stations, some tourism, but these activities employ relatively few people and generate limited economic activity compared to the coast. The coastal cities, by contrast, have everything going for them: access to the ocean, access to trade routes and international markets. Australia's economy is heavily dependent on exports: iron ore, coal, natural gas, agricultural products, education services. The major ports are all coastal. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide are all port cities. They connect Australia to the rest of the world. Building a major city in the interior would mean being cut off from these trade networks, requiring expensive transportation infrastructure to move goods to and from the coast. It simply doesn't make economic sense when the coast offers so many advantages. There's also a historical dimension to this pattern. When Europeans first arrived in Australia in 1788, they naturally established their first settlement on the coast, Sydney Cove. As the population grew, new settlements were established, but almost all of them were coastal or near coastal. Early explorers did venture into the interior, and some of their expeditions ended in disaster precisely because of the harsh conditions. The Burke and Wills expedition of 1860 to 1861 set out to cross Australia from south to north. Both leaders died on the return journey, along with most of their party, largely due to the harsh conditions and lack of water and food. These early experiences reinforced the understanding that the interior was dangerous and unsuitable for settlement. As Australia's population grew through immigration, people naturally gravitated to where opportunities already existed: the coastal cities. Infrastructure was built in these areas: universities, hospitals, transportation networks, cultural institutions, all developed in the major coastal centers. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. More people meant more economic opportunities, which attracted more people. The interior, meanwhile, remained sparsely populated, which meant less infrastructure, fewer services, and less economic opportunity. Why would someone choose to live in a remote town hundreds of kilometers from a major hospital or university when they could live in a coastal city with all modern amenities? Climate plays a role in lifestyle factors too. The Australian coast offers a temperate climate in the south and a subtropical climate in the north. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth. These cities have relatively mild winters and warm, but not unbearable summers, moderated by proximity to the ocean. Ocean breezes provide natural cooling. Beaches offer recreation. The Mediterranean-style climate of cities like Perth and Adelaide is particularly pleasant. Compare this to the interior, where temperature swings can be extreme. Scorching hot in summer, sometimes surprisingly cold in winter, with no moderating influence from large bodies of water. Given the choice, most people prefer the more comfortable coastal climate. Let's look at some specific numbers to really drive home how extreme this coastal concentration is. Sydney, Australia's largest city, has a population of over 5 million people. Melbourne has nearly the same. Brisbane has about 2.5 million. Perth has about 2 million. Adelaide has about 1.3 million. These 5 cities alone account for roughly 15 million people. That's nearly 60% of Australia's entire population in just 5 metropolitan areas, all on the coast. If you add in the smaller coastal cities and towns, places like Gold Coast, Newcastle, Wollongong, Cairns, Darwin, Hobart, you quickly get to that 85 to 90% figure living near the coast. Meanwhile, the entire Northern Territory, which covers about 1.4 million square kilometers, about 18% of Australia's land area, has a population of only about 250,000 people. That's a population density of less than 1 person per 5 square kilometers. South Australia, which includes vast stretches of the outback, has about 1.8 million people, but over 75% of them live in Adelaide. The actual interior regions have almost no one. Towns in the outback might have populations of a few hundred or even a few dozen people, separated by hundreds of kilometers of empty land. There are exceptions, of course. Some inland cities do exist. Canberra, the capital, is inland, but it's only about 150 kilometers from the coast and was deliberately planned as a compromise capital between Sydney and Melbourne. Alice Springs, right in the centre of Australia, has about 25,000 people. It exists partly as a service centre for the surrounding region, partly for tourism. It's near Uluru, one of Australia's most famous landmarks, and partly for government services. But Alice Springs is the exception that proves the rule. It's isolated, expensive to live in, and exists for specific reasons rather than natural economic advantages. Towns like Mount Isa, Kalgoorlie, and Broken Hill exist because of mining operations. When the mines close or become less productive, these towns often decline. Is this pattern ever going to change? Could Australia's interior ever become more populated? The short answer is probably not significantly, at least not with current or foreseeable technology and economic conditions. The fundamental geographical and climatic factors aren't going to change. Australia isn't going to suddenly grow tall mountain ranges that create different rainfall patterns. It's not going to drift to a different latitude with more favorable atmospheric conditions. Climate change is actually making parts of the interior even hotter and drier, not more habitable. Some climate models predict that southern Australia will become drier over the coming decades, which would make the interior even less attractive for settlement. Could technology change things? Theoretically, yes. If water became abundant and cheap through massive desalination projects, if renewable energy made air conditioning and infrastructure costs trivial, if transportation technology advanced to the point where distance didn't matter, then perhaps settlement patterns could shift. but we're talking about enormous investments for very uncertain returns. Why spend billions or trillions of dollars to make the interior habitable when the coast already offers everything needed to support a population 80 times larger than Australia currently has? The coastal cities aren't running out of room. They're sprawling outward and building upward. There's no pressing need to move inland. Some people do romanticize the idea of developing the interior. There have been various schemes proposed over the years. Massive water diversion projects, planned inland cities, agricultural development schemes. Almost none of them have materialized in any significant way because the economics don't work. The Ord River irrigation scheme in Western Australia, started in the 1960s, was supposed to turn the tropical north into an agricultural powerhouse. After billions of dollars of investment, it supports a relatively small agricultural industry and a tiny population. The soil and climate challenges proved harder to overcome than expected. The distances to markets made many crops economically unviable. It's a reminder that you can't simply engineer your way past fundamental geographical constraints without enormous and often unjustifiable costs. What about climate refugees or population pressures in the future? If Australia's population grows significantly, or if people need to move from coastal areas due to sea level rise, could the interior become more attractive? Possibly, but even then, people would more likely move to regional coastal areas or expand existing cities, rather than strike out into the desert. The pattern might spread a bit further from the current major centres, but it's unlikely to fundamentally change. The factors that make the interior difficult to inhabit aren't going away. There's something almost poetic about Australia's population distribution. It's a massive continent that looks imposing on a map, but the reality is that it's mostly a shell. A narrow rim of habitability surrounding a vast, empty core. It's sometimes called the dead heart of Australia, though that's not quite fair. The interior isn't dead. It has unique ecosystems, indigenous communities who have lived there for tens of thousands of years, and a harsh beauty all its own. But it's not a place that can or likely will ever support dense populations. The indigenous peoples who lived in the interior before European contact did so with sophisticated knowledge of the land, moving with the seasons, knowing where to find water and food, living in small, mobile groups. Their way of life was sustainable precisely because it was low density and adapted to the harsh conditions. High density permanent settlement is a different proposition entirely. So when you see those striking images of Australia from space, or look at a population density map that shows the coastal rim glowing with cities and the interior nearly black with emptiness, you're seeing the end result of millions of years of geological and climatic history. You're seeing a continent shaped by its position on the globe, by the age of its rocks, by the patterns of wind and rain, by the presence and absence of water, and you're seeing human populations doing what they've always done, concentrating where life is easier, where water is available, where the climate is more moderate, where economic opportunities exist. Australia is one of the most urbanized countries on Earth, with about 90% of the population living in urban areas, but it's also one of the most coastal countries on Earth. These two facts are intimately connected. The cities grew on the coast because that's where the advantages were, and they'll likely stay there, growing larger and denser, while the vast interior remains one of the emptiest places on the planet. It's a population distribution that's not about choice or preference alone, but about the hard realities of geography, geology, and climate. The interior of Australia isn't empty because Australians are lazy or unimaginative. It's empty because nature, operating over millions of years, created conditions that make dense human settlement they're extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The coast isn't just more pleasant, it's fundamentally more viable, and that's why 90% of Australians live there, and why that number is unlikely to change anytime soon. If you found this deep dive into Australia's unique geography fascinating, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We explore the hidden geographical and historical forces that shape our world. From why countries are shaped the way they are to how climate and geology influence, where civilizations rise and fall. There's so much more to discover, so subscribe and join us on the next journey into the forces that make our planet so endlessly interesting.